Hey guys, it's CyrusofChaos. So I never really considered doing a talking head video before my reaction video to the fencing's biggest open secret video. But since making that video, many people have asked why I don't do things like that more often. So not really having an answer, I decided to start doing things like this more often. So today we're going to be talking about a topic that's pretty confusing and convoluted, but I get asked about it a lot, so it makes sense to have a video about it, and that topic is Olympic qualification. So before we get into the specifics of that, I wanted to just sum up a little bit about the Olympics in general and fencing at the Olympics specifically. So the first thing is that there are two types of Olympics. There's the Summer Olympics and the Winter Olympics. The Summer Olympics are held every 4 years on a year that's divisible by 4, so like 1996, 2000, 2004, etc. The one obvious exception being Tokyo, which was in 2021 because of the pandemic, although we still call it the 2020 Games for some reason. And then in order to be in the Summer Olympics, your sport has to have nothing to do with ice or snow. And then the Winter Olympics, meanwhile, is held on every other even number year, the even numbers that are not divisible by 4. So 1994, 1998, 2002, 2006, etc. And in order to be in that Olympics, you must have something to do with snow or ice in your sport. Even if your sport is considered a winter sport, no snow or ice, it's not a Winter Olympic sport, it's a Summer Olympic sport. So both Olympics used to be held in the same year. I don't know exactly when or why that changed, but that is no longer the case today. So on to fencing more specifically. Fencing is one of only 5 Olympic sports that has been in all modern Olympics, and you can probably use logic and common sense to figure out that the others are cycling, swimming, track and field, and gymnastics. Basically, the sports that didn't require a ton of modern equipment, those are the ones that have been in all of them. Until the 1980s, women didn't fence épée or saber because, according to opinions at the time, women were, 1, considered too weak to fence épée or saber, and 2, those weapons were considered dueling weapons, and since dueling was the man's job, or something equally silly, women were not permitted to fence épée or saber. Now, that's no longer the case, obviously, but before women's épée was added in 1996, there were only 8 medals allocated for fencing. Those medals went to men's foil, men's épée, men's saber, and women's foil for individual and for team events. So 8 total. Once women's épée was added, they're like, no problem, you can have 2 more medals for those events. But when we came back in 2004 and requested 2 more medals be given for women's saber, they're like, oh my god, you guys want another weapon added? 2 more events? That's okay, fine, do what you want, but we're not giving you any more medals. So that created a bit of a problem for us because we now had 12 events that we wanted to host, but only 10 medals. The solution was to drop 2 team events on a rotation every year. The first year that women's saber was included, all individual and all team men's events, all individual women's events, but only women's épée had a team event as well. And then in 2008, men's foil and women's épée lost their team event. In 2012, men's épée and women's saber lost their team events. In 2016, men's saber and women's foil lost their team events, and it was supposed to repeat on that cycle. But in 2016, or after 2016 rather, there was a new decision that was made to allow fencing to have 2 more medals. So starting in 2020, there would always be 12 medals and no event would get cut. In the years that those events got cut, there would be a World Championships, but just for those events. So in 2016, for example, there was no men's saber or women's foil team event at the Olympics, but there was a World Championships held only for that weapon. During an Olympic year, there are no World Championships held for the other individual or team weapons. So, as I understand it, before a certain point in many, if not all, sports, each country could send a certain quota of athletes to the games with no other particular qualification criteria, or at least very little qualification criteria. Then at some point in the 1990s, the number of the entrants started getting so unmanageably large that the Olympics started to reduce the ability to attend the games by adding specific qualification criteria for each sport, which, fair enough. I don't know the exact, fully nuanced criteria for all the sports because they are all very different, but I'm going to try to discuss a little bit of the general qualification for the 4 sports that we talked about before that have been in the Olympics every single time along with fencing. So the first sport that we're going to talk about is track and field. So each event in track and field, of which there are many, are given a certain number of athletes who can compete, and each athlete can qualify at any time during the season by achieving a certain time for some sort of racing event or a score or a distance, whatever you want to call it, for something like shot put or the high jump or the long, whatever. So basically, if you make that criteria, you qualify for the Olympics immediately, whether it's the first competition of the season or the last competition of the season, as long as it's during a competition during the qualification period. And so half of the slots go to athletes who achieve those times and scores, and then the rest of the slots are given to people on the world rating. This basically ensures that the best athletes in the world are all present in track and field, which to me seems like a very good system. Swimming is very similar. If you get one of the qualification times during any of the swim races, then you qualify immediately and automatically. Again, that's pretty good. Cycling's a little bit different. 90% of the qualification slots go to the athletes directly off the world ratings, and the rest are granted at qualification tournaments. Again, that's a good system. It ensures that everyone in the top X amount of people is competing, and if you want your best and strongest competing, that's a good way to do it. Gymnastics is a bit more complicated, but essentially team qualification, very similarly to fencing, is the most important thing, where there are only 12 teams that can compete. 3 of them are chosen at the World Championships, for this Olympics. 3 of them were chosen at the World Championships in 2022, and the other 9 teams were chosen at the Olympics, at the World Championships in 2023. And then individuals who aren't competing for one of those 12 teams are determined in a different qualification process, but that's a little more complicated. I couldn't just understand it by reading a couple articles quickly, so we're not going to get into it here. But it does sound a little bit like fencing in that respect. So the underlying tone, or the underlying theme of the Olympics, has always been that the best in the world compete in each sport, and it seems like the qualification process for each of the sports that I just talked about support that theme, with gymnastics having a bit of a convoluted process just like us, as I mentioned before, but in general, the best are competing in each of those sports. So Olympic qualification for fencing is a bit more complicated, so let's discuss how qualification works in fencing. So first, the top 4 teams qualified directly, and when a team qualifies, each of those teams automatically gets 3 individual spots plus 1 alternate spot. And after that, the next 4 teams that qualify are based on rating from each zone. So in addition to the top 4 teams, there are 4 more teams who are the top in the European zone, not from the top 4, the top of the Asian/Oceania zone, the top of the American zone, and the top of the African zone. And then each of those zonal teams has to be in the top 16 in order to qualify a team. So for example, if the American zone didn't have someone in the top 16, it would just go to the next person on world ranking. And so once those teams are all selected, you get 2 individual fencers from the European zone, 2 individual fencers from the Asian zone, 1 individual fencer from the American zone, and 1 individual fencer from the African zone. Then after that, anyone who didn't qualify someone from any other country for that weapon gets to send an athlete to the zonal qualification tournament. Only the winner of this tournament gets to attend the Olympics, And so it is probably an unbelievably grueling mental experience to go through something like that, knowing that your Olympic dream is on the line and you have to literally win the tournament in order to get it. I used the fencingparis2024.com website to keep track of the Olympic qualification because it's just too complicated for each weapon to discuss. And I'm going to talk about some of the oddities of each of the points lists as they sit now, or from a few of the points lists as they sit now that happen in each weapon. So let's look at men's saber first, which is my weapon that I used to compete in, and so I know the most about this one. Now, just looking at this, the way it's color-coded, green are teams that are qualified from the world zone on the left, and on the right, anybody who's in green is qualified from their team. So, as you can see just right off the bat, on the right side of the page, pretty much all the top athletes are highlighted either yellow or green, meaning that they're qualifying from their zone or they're qualifying directly from a team. That is a pretty good way to do it. A few fencers like Teodosiu, Yildirim, Hrychuk get a little bit shafted because they're in that top whatever and they don't get an automatic spot. Because they're in pink, it means they get to go compete at that crazy tournament that I was talking about before. So, but in general, the list on the left makes sense, although it seems a little bit unfair that a team like Germany, which is 7th in the world, doesn't get to qualify over a team like Canada, which is 11th in the world. Not knocking the Canadians in any way, but if we're supposed to have the best people competing in each one, it seems much more logical to me to make it based purely on world rating. And this also creates a few oddities within the sport because you're not really competing against everybody. Each person's Olympic qualification path is completely different, and so there are a lot of cases where like certain teams are just competing against like one other team, and certain individuals are just competing against one other individual. So it's a very strange system. So for example, let's look at Germany like we said before. Germany can only qualify if Italy is behind them. And so for example, like if Germany passes Italy, then Germany will go and Italy will not. That makes sense. Let's look at the women's saber quickly because I know that there's a few more oddities on this one. So here you're going to see on the right that there are several people who are highlighted in white who are in the top of the points list. And that means these guys don't get to qualify by any means at all. As I mentioned before, only one person from each country can go unless you qualify a team. And so, because Giuntora is currently 4th in the world, and Yoriadu is currently 5th in the world, only one of them gets to go to the Olympics because they're both from Greece. And there's not a strong Greek team. So that's a very strange thing that these two, who are both phenomenal fencers, they have both won multiple World Cups and Grand Prix, and they've both, I think, medaled at World Championships. Only one of them gets to go, despite the fact that right now one of them is 4th in the world and one of them is 5th. Very odd. Someone also like Joanna Ilieva, who is currently 8th in the world, well, she can't qualify because she's not the top 2 in the European zone. So she is directly competing with Lucia Martin Portuguese right now, and to a slightly lesser extent Giuntora. But do you see what I mean? Like, these two people are competing directly against each other for Olympic qualification. Lucia Martin Portuguese and Joanna Ilieva are competing directly against each other for Olympic qualification. And same thing with Xiaoyaki here. She's competing directly against Yang for Olympic qualification because only one of them will be able to go. So it's a strange system. Meanwhile, over here, this blue means that even though it's supposed to be a European one, an Asian one, an African one, and an American one, the American team is outside the top 16. And so Italy only gets to go as long as Mexico is outside the top 16. But if Mexico can get enough points to pass Hong Kong, then suddenly Italy will no longer be eligible to go to the Olympics as a team, which again is a very odd situation to be in. And there's not a whole lot that Italy can do about that. It's just if Mexico does well or not. The thing Italy can do, I suppose, is they can pass Ukraine to be the number one European country in the team ranking list. But again, it's a very strange system. So anyway, that's roughly how Olympic qualification works for fencing. So quickly now, back to the Olympics in general. Above everything else, the Olympics has become a brand and a business in the last couple of decades. The word Olympics creates a very strong sense of respect immediately, and Olympians are lauded as the best athletes on earth. A lot of the time after an Olympic Games is over, you'll see Olympians endorsing breakfast cereals, action figures, a whole bunch of things, and people pay a lot to have an Olympian sponsor it. Like, oh, I get up every morning and before I run 58 miles, I have a bowl of Wheaties because it keeps me going for a long time. And kids will see that a very successful athlete eats Wheaties for breakfast, will ask their parents to get them, and that creates buzz around the product, which is worth a lot of money. And part of that is because of the Olympic brand. So the ISC is very aware of the power of this brand, and they understand that by limiting that brand, they're making it much more valuable, and that way they can make more money as a business. So for that reason, it's in their best interest to reduce the number of Olympians as much as possible, because the rarer that brand is, the more it's worth. And so tickets to the event are quite expensive. Networks which show Olympic footage pay an arm and a leg to be able to broadcast the games. Olympic footage used in documentaries and TV shows isn't cheap either, and the minimum price for 1 second of Olympic footage is $49, and it can go up to $79 per second, depending on how highly the footage is rated by the Olympics. And if the spirit of the Olympics really is about having the best athletes in the world competing against each other, it seems very odd that the qualification for fencing is so complicated and leaves out so many top people. Maybe instead of the strange process that we have, it should follow something more along the lines of the cycling format, where it can just be a flat number on the points list, maybe top 32 or top 32 or top 48 for individual qualification, and then there could be a few slots that go to people from different zones, either based on the tournament if we really want to keep that, or some wild card, maybe finishing with a medal during the season qualifies you, or something like along those lines. And then it seems strange that team qualification allows you to qualify individuals. Why not separate them? Have one process for Olympic qualification for individuals based on ranking, and then have another one based on teams. That way, it would just be your individual prowess that gets you a ticket to the individual games, and your team's prowess that gets you a ticket to the team games. Maybe the top 8 teams on the rank list would go with 4 additional teams from each zone, or something like that. But it seems weird to continue to have this process, and call me crazy, but in my opinion, I think it's past time to make this process a bit more streamlined and less nonsensical, so that the actual best athletes in each weapon get to compete in the Olympics. And you don't have oddities like the number 5 fencer in the world being left out of the games with no possible means of qualifying. And then that's all I've got to say about Olympic qualification. The last thing I wanted to say is that I don't get paid anything for this, and so any CyrusofChaos stuff is coming out of my own pocket. I'm doing it on my own time, and so unless I'm getting a small inconsistent amount from YouTube, or your very generous donations, I don't make any money from this. So if you guys want to help contribute to my Patreon account, or you just want to Venmo or PayPal me just a little bit just once, that would really be appreciated. And links to that can be found in the video description. Thanks very much. If you have questions that were not answered by this or nuances that you want addressed, leave them in the comments and I will respond to all of them. Thanks, guys.